So we're on Kuf Yud Ches, and we got up to Yad Dinavela Lomali, which is about two-thirds down, and then the internet went on us. So the Gemara now is going to introduce an Eno Inyan, which means that since we have an extra pasuk in Yad with regard to the halacha of Yad to be motzi and machnis tuma. So why do I need an extra pasuk? Is tneu l'inyan liyad di alma. So we're talking about ochlin, and the pasuk of yados with regard to ochlin is going to teach us based on the fact that it's superfluous, because we derived it logically from the vela, as we saw earlier. So we're going to derive from this that Yud of Ochlin not only can export Tuma to be the vehicle and the go-between to export Tuma, which is more pashut, but we could even upgrade the power of Yad to import Tuma. That means if the sheretz came in contact with the Yad, it would transfer Tuma to the Ochel. So the Gemara says, now we're left with three limudim, and that's the perfect number that we need. We have Yad lahachnis, Yad lahotzi, and Shomer litzarif, right? Shomer to be mashlim the shear of Kizayis with regard to Tumas Nevela. Vakati, the Gemara says, Yad dinevela itztrich. Wait a second, we're not out in the clear yet. We still need Yad in the case of Nevela. In other words, we've been assuming that if Yad is effective in Ochlin, then how much more so would it be effective in Nevela? But the Gemara says no. To Ilo Kos Rachmana ben Nevela, if we wouldn't have the halacha of Yad in Nevela, and then we derive it from the tzad hashava between Zroim and Tanur, Havamina Dail Vamina Din Minos Kolodin. You can't derive from a Kavachomer more than the Kavachomer itself. And Mahanach, just like in these cases of Zroim and Tanur, Lo Metame Adam, because these are Rishon Latuma, but not capable of being Metame Adam V'Kelim. For that, you need an Avatuma, is Af Nevela Lo Metame Adam. We should come to the conclusion that Yad of Nevela, which is right, that hide that's attached to the meat, which is derived from Yad Liochlin, would have that limitation that it could only be Metame Ochlin, but not Adam V'Kelim. El Yad Nevela Mitzach Tzarech. So at the end of the day, we need to derive Yad even for Nevela, and we cannot derive it from a Kavachomer because we want to expand the application of Yad through this limud to apply even to Adam V'Kelim like Nevela itself. But V'Shomer de Nevela hu de lo tzarech. The extra pasuk now becomes Shomer de Nevela. And why? Because of the logic that we had earlier. L'mayil ch'sakasir rachmaniki I litztarufe amit lo mitztarif. Right? There is no din of tziruf in Nevela to be mashlim the shear of Kizayis and generate Nevela Hamatame through Yad. Ulahotzi, and if on the other hand, you need the pasuk to teach you based on Yad li Ochlin, the halach of Yad li Tuma lahotzi, meaning to transmit Tuma, is kal vachomer miyad asi, right? That we can derive from kal vachomer, because if yad has the power lahachnis, then certainly yad has the power lahotzi. And therefore we end up with one extra pasuk. And what's it needed for? And the answer is, says the Gemara, Taneu inyan liyad nevela. But we already derived yad nevela from the previous Yalfusa, and therefore, once again, we can operate with the Imeno Inyan, as we said earlier, the Imeno Inyan liyad nevela, Taneu inyan liyad dialma. So we don't need anything for yad nevela, because that we derive already from the pasuk. I remember the extra words for you in the pasuk is Taneu il inyan liyad di alma. So I'm going to use it to apply the law of yad in general, regard to all ochlin. So now the mention of yodos in this pasuk of ochlin teaches yad of ochlin not only, as we said, to receive the tumah, but also to export the tumah. And the Gemara says, okay, what do we have now? Let's put the piece of the puzzle together and calculate what we have. We have Yad Lahotzi, we have Yad Lahachnis, and we have Shomer Litzare. So everything fits into place. Another Yad Lahotzi will be derived from the pasuk that we had with Zorea, right? Edible Zroim. And Yad Lahachnis was from the extra mention of the Shomer in the pasuk in Nevela. The halacha that Shomer would integrate to form the shear for ochlin of a kibetza, that's derived from the pasuk of kol zera. And now we turn to Kuf Yud Ches Amud Beis. Frek the Gemara, the Ema, the piece of the puzzle still don't fit exactly into place, because I could suggest the following: Im eno inyu shomer denavela, right? You don't need it for shomer devela, which we derive from a pasuk. Tneu inyu shomer di alma, and therefore we would have the halacha of shomer with regard to tumas ochlin, shomer lahachnis, shomer litzaref. That what are we going to do? We're not going to derive yad lahachnis, as we said, is a bigger chiddush, because it's going to be metame the ochlin that are becheskes tara, as we discussed earlier. So that becomes an empty spot, and it cannot be filled now because we need shomer bialma, which means we have yad, at least as far as lahotzi is concerned, to pass on the tumah, and now we're going to need the pasuk for shomer, and we'll need two psukim, one for shomer lahachnis and one for shomer litzaref. Again, shomer is always one level, at least, above yad, because it protects the food. So now we're going to assume that the status of shomer is even lahachnis against the cheskes tara, and we'll have another pasuk for shomer litzaref, that it could integrate to form the kibetza shear for ochlin. But then we're left with a gap. Aval yad lahachnis lo. We don't have any pasuk to fill in that extended chumrah of yad lahachnis, meaning to be metame the food that's tahor in the yad. So at this point, the Gemara seems to drop the ball on this whole mahalach that the capacity of yad to be machnis tuma is going to be derived from a verse, because instead we need that verse for shomer lahachnis lahotzi, and then the extra pasuk for shomer litzaref elamikara. But rather, let's take a different approach. When the Torah writes and formulates the halacha of yad, ki ksiva yad, achnasa ksiva, right? That was the greater chiddush, that even to bring tumah to the ochlin, yad is sufficient. And now, once we know that yad is effective lahachnis, then as far as lahotzi is concerned, that's a kal v'chom. If it has the power so profound that it could be machnis, then for sure it could be motzi. So now we come to the conclusion that yad in ochlin is both lahotzi and even lahachnis. And if that be the case, now we can effectuate that other kal v'chomer from yad to shomer, because the yad does not protect, let's say, the meat or the kernels of grains, whereas shomer does. And then we're left with a pasuk of shomer and ochlin, and that's going to teach us litzarif, right? That the shear of kibetza could be made up by adding and integrating the shomer. Okay, but now we've covered our bases as far as ochlin are concerned. What about nevela? El shomer de nevela lomali. So again, once we introduce the kal v'chomer, that from yad we could certainly derive shomer, then we're going to do the same thing with regard to a shomer of nevela, with regard to the hide that protects the nevela. Now, we justified the necessity for the limud, the yalfusa, that a yad of nevela can be machnis tuma, because again, we couldn't derive it from the combination of the oven and the seeds because of the dio principle, and we wouldn't know that yad of nevela could be metame even adam. But now the question is, says Rashi, why did the Torah need to mention a shomer and nevela by saying that, one who touches the nevela shall become tameh? The Gemara says that this doesn't teach us anything new about a shomer. Legufe, ulamai. If you're telling me that the shomer hide will integrate into the kezayis of the basar of nevela in order to be metami tumas nevela as an avatuma amrit lo mitztarif. We just finished saying in our Mishnah, and we repeat it over and over again, that there is no integration of the hide of the R to form the volume of a kezayis in nevela. Ila hafnes lahotzi kavachomer miyad asya. Right? We always say that shomer is one up it on yad. And the Gemara says, Milsa diasi b'kavachomer torach v'kosav lokra, that we have a principle that sometimes even that which could be derived from a kavachomer is spelled out explicitly by the Torah. Torah doesn't want to rely on our ability to derive a kal v'chomer. If that be the case, then shomer di alma emelecha lahachnis. Maybe in general, going back to Ochlin, right, that we wanted to mention a shomer in general for Ochlim is why not apply the same principle? Then milsu di asim kal v'chomer tarach v'kasav l'kra. So again, even though shomer di alma could have certainly been derived from a kal v'chomer, but maybe the Torah wanted to bother writing it out explicitly. So how do you assume that the pasuk is teaching us that the shomer of food can integrate with the food itself to generate the measure of a kibetza and ochlet? Right? We had an assumption that you could derive lahachnes ulahotzi from a kal v'chomer, and therefore the pasuk has to be teaching me the law of tziruf. But if now you're saying that the Torah is tarach v'kasav l'kra, then we really haven't justified, the psukim. And the Gemara answers, "Heichadi kol midrash tarshinan." When do we use that principle of tarach v'kasav l'kra? It's only if we have no choice, but if it's possible to justify a superfluous verse, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're not going to rely on tarach v'kasav l'kra. Now, the Gemara is going to quote Rav Chaviva. And this is a different answer to the original Shakavitaria that we had, that maybe the pasuk in Yad of Ochlin is teaching us only lahotzi, but not lahachnis. And now Rav Chaviva is going to go back to our original premise that the argument is convincing and it's valid, and the law of lahachnis is actually derived from a different pasuk. And this is the pasuk that deals explicitly and addresses the shomer and the vela, which cannot be used in its own context, and therefore let's use it in the context of a yad for Ochlin. The Gemara had thrown that out based on the argument that we should rather give it an application to the shomer of Ochlin, because that's the original subject of shomrim. So we're talking about a shomer of an ochel. Rav Chaviva Rashani shomer denevela. Right, we said that with regard to nevela, a shomer does not integrate to form and be mashlim the shear of kizayis for tumas nevela. But a shomer of ochlin does have that element of tzira for the shear of kibetza. Is kaven the maisi yad ka'ovid, a yad shadinale. So the shomer nevela is actually functioning as a yad with regard to tumah, which means that it's machnis tumah, but it doesn't integrate to form the shear of kizayis, and therefore this pasuk could be assigned to the law of yad of ochlin rather than shomer of ochlin. In any event, the bottom line is that we have some measure of success over here in providing all the psukim that we need for all the different dinim that we want to derive from them. So, for example, the din that a shomer in Ochlin can be integrated to form the shear of Tumah, right? That we derived already from the pasuk of Nevela that fell on a seed, if you remember. And now Tumah pertains to edible seeds that are in a state in which people take them for sowing, namely in their husks, as we discussed back on Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis. So the Gemara says, I'm not sure that that pasuk is really a valid derivation. Maskef lo Rabbi Yehuda bar Yishmael Hadasnan. We learned in the Mishnah in Uktzin at the end of Shas. Ha pitma shel rimo mitztarefes. Right, there's a pitum on top of a pomegranate, and that will integrate to set up the pomegranate with a kshir of kibetza for tumah. But vanetz shelo eno mitztaref. Right, the pitum is the blossom that sprouts on top of the pomegranate, like a blossom of an apple. The netz is part of the plant that grows around the pitum. The pitum protects the pomegranate, and therefore it's called the shomer. The netz, on the other hand, protects the pitum. So it's really a double, it's a double piggyback. It's a netz, which is a shomer l'shomer. It doesn't really protect the rimon itself. It's sort of like, you have the outermost shell that surrounds the walnut. That's going to protect the inner shell, which in turn is protecting the food. And the Gemara in Kuf Yud Tesam and Beis, hopefully for tomorrow, will teach us that when a food has several layers of protection, the outer layer does not combine, and it's not mitzarif with the food of the tumah. It's a shomer of a shomer, not a shomer. So the pitum combines with the pomegranate, the netz does not. Bamai. Why does the pitum combine with the pomegranate? Kri kan al kol zera zarua. Veleka. Right? We can apply the principle of, and its carcass will fall upon any seed of a seed plant that is sown, implying in the state in which people take it out for sowing, veleka, it has no application. You can't describe a pomegranate containing its pitum as being in the state in which people take it out for sowing. A pomegranate's not a seed that's planted. Secondly, if, let's say, one did plant a pomegranate, the pitum, the blossom, has already fallen off. So if the source for the din of shomrim combining mitzaref with the food is this pasuk of any seed that can be sown, the pitum of pomegranate should not be included. Visu, and furthermore, the Gemara objects, Hodesnan, what about our Mishnah? Ha'or v'arot v'kipa mitzaref l'tami tumas ochlin minolam. We still don't have a source from which we could derive the principle that the hide, etc., is integrated with the meat for tumah. I mean, the pasuk itself only mentions zarua, not nevela. I'm sorry, not. Right. The pasuk only talks about seeds. It doesn't say anything about basar. Elo, but rather tlosa kroiksi. We have three psukim. Number one, I'll call zera zerua asher yizarea. So we have the word zera three times. Chad l'shomer dizroim. So we're talking about seeds. Chad l'shomer ilanos. Right, because we said in the case of ilanos, we don't have that logic of, this is the way you plant it. So we need a special pasuk for the fruits of trees. Idach, and the third pasuk is l'shomer basar ubeitzin. That which doesn't grow from the ground, meat, eggs, fish, and that's mitzaref for tumah. So we have one pasuk teaching the law of shomrim for zroim. right? Because the husks are sown in that way. Now we have another one to include fruits, because the fruit itself can be sown. And the third includes even foods that cannot be sown. Amar Reb Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav, Yesh yad l'tuma, v'ein yad lehechsher. So we said that Ochlin requires one of the machshirim in order to be mukshal l'kabel tuma. Rav holds that a yad is effective only for lahachnis ulahotzi, but not for hechsher. So let's say water touches the stem of a fruit. The fruit is not mukshal l'kabel tuma. For Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and he says yesh yad l'tuma lahechsher, which means again, if the water touches the stem of the fruit, then it's machshir l'kabel tuma. Mifli, what's at the root of this machlokas between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, right? About water that moistens the handle of a food, whether it makes the food mukshal l'kabel tuma. Now, the Rishonim point out that Rav and Rabbi Yochanan have no issue with a shomer as a hechsher, right? Because that pasuk of any seed that is sown deals with hechsher. Ibo, I say, I'm going to one pshat svara. Ibo, I say, makra. It's a matter of how to interpret the Torah. Ibo, I say, kra. The Gemara always starts with the kra first. Right, so the law of Heksher says if water, that was that middle pasuk there in Perek Yud, water had been placed upon a seed, and then an avela falls upon it, it's tummy for you. Mar Savar going to Rav Mikra Nidrus Lefanov Velo Lefnei Fanov. Right, you only expound the pasuk to, let's say, interpret that which appears immediately before the pasuk, which is the carcass falls upon it, but not on the phrase that appears before the one immediately before it, if the water had been placed on a seed. So the law of Yados, which is alluded to in the word for you, applies only to Tumah, but not to Hechsher. Umar Sova, but Yochanan holds, Mikra Nidrash Lefanov, V'Lefnei V'Fanov. So in this case, where it says for you, we're going to expound the pasuk, and it's going to shed a light on the phrase that immediately appears before it, namely, and the carcass falls at it, and additionally in the phrase that appears before that one immediately before it, but if the water had been placed upon a seed. So the law of Yados applies not only to Tumah, but also to Hechsher. Ibay say Misvara, Mar Savar Hechsher Tchilas Tumahu. Rav Yochanan holds that Hechsher is the beginning of the process of Tumah. Umar Savar Rav holds Hechsher Lav Tchilas Tumahu. Everybody agrees that a pasuk could only be darshaning on mikra lefanov, v'lo lefnei fanov. And therefore the pasuk of Yados is only referring to Tumah, not to Hechsher. Rabbi Yochanan holds, nevertheless, that it automatically applies to Hechsher because Hechsher is the first stage of Tumah. Rav, on the other hand, doesn't classify and identify Hechsher as part of the process of Tumah, and therefore we need a separate prerequisite. He maintains, therefore, that there's no basis for applying the law of Yados to Hechsher. Tanya Kavosei de Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to bring a price to support Rabbi Yochanan. Kshem sheish yad l'tuma, kach yesh yad lehechsher. Kshem she'ein mekablim tuma, ela l'chshi tolshu. Kach ein mekablim hechsher ad shi tolshu. So we have an absolute equation with tuma and hechsher tuma in two contexts. Number one, with regard to yad, and number two, with regard to mechubel karka versus tolish min karka. And there's no tuma in mechubel karka. There's no hechsher in mekubel tam. The water fell on that which is attached from the ground. It's not machshir until it's detached from the ground. Omar Rav, ein yad lefochos mikizayis. A yad has to be a minimum of a volume of a kizayis. In order for food to be eligible for a yad, it must measure at least a kizayis. Anything smaller than a kizayis is not significant enough to have a yad. The ain't shomer lefachos mikipul. Pul is like a large bean. So there's no such thing as a shomer unless it has the size of a pul. Rav Yochanan Amar, yesh yad lefachos mikazayis, yesh shomer lefachos mikipul. And the Gemara is now going to challenge Rav from a brisa of Shtei Atzamos. So Rav maintains that any food smaller than the volume of a large bean is not significant enough to have a shomer. A large bean's volume, kipul, is smaller than a kizayis. Unlike a yad, for which the minimum measure is a food that is smaller than a large bean, any food that is smaller than a large bean does not qualify to have its protective cover classified as a shomer that combines for tumah and imports and exports tumah. So if a small bone contains less than a kapul of marrow, and together with all other foods they measure a kibetza, the volume of the bone may not be included in the kibetza measure, nor does it deliver tumah to and from the marrow. And the same applies to lentils in their pod. When lentils do not add up to a kapul, the pod does not combine for tumah or deliver tumah. Any food that has the volume of a large bean, however, does qualify for the law of shomrim, even though it's excluded from the law of yados, until it's as large as a kizayis. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, any amount of food qualifies for a shomer. There's no minimum measure for a shomer. Rabbi Yochanan concedes, however, that a food must have a certain measure in order to qualify for a yad. Unlike Rav, who states it's got to be a measure of a kizayis, Rabbi Yochanan holds that the measure is a kipul. And that's implicit in the fact that he divides his ruling into two clauses. He doesn't simply state there's a yad as well as a shomer for less than a large bean. Rabbi Yochanan means there's a yad for less than an olive's volume, but there's only a shomer, not a yad, for less than a large bean's volume. So Machlok Shin Rav and Rabbi Yochanan pertains not only to tumas ochlin, but also to other tumas such as tumas nevela and tumas mes. In every case, Rav holds that the smallest measure that qualifies for yad and shomer are a kazayis or a kapul, and Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. So this we're going to stop for today on the bottom of Kuf Yud Ches Amid Beis, as we move through this sugi of Tumah V'tar.